Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you watched my video yesterday, and very few people did, with most people choosing to rather comment on the YouTube post that I made. So for those of you who did, thanks very much, and look out for that documentary that I mentioned. It will be coming soon. But before I get on to the main video of today, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It really does help. And if you want to support the work that I do here, you're welcome to buy me a coffee. The link is in the description box below. So, as I was saying, if you watched my video yesterday, you will have recalled that I mentioned that the DA had tabled a bill to replace BEE. Now, in typical fashion, the worst president that South Africa has ever had, Cyril Ramaphosa, has flatly rejected calls to scrap or reform black economic empowerment. This obviously because many have suggested that Ramaphosa himself benefited and became rather rich by BEE, and as I said in my video yesterday, asking chickens to vote for KFC is just stupid. They're never going to do it. Now, Ramaphosa has said BEE is here to stay, and he's calling it a constitutional necessity to correct apartheid structural inequalities. And this is obviously in reference to the fact that the Constitution references forms of redress. Now, Cyril Ramaphosa criticized the DA for not yet presenting a viable alternative, implying that any colorblind model would perpetuate inequality. And so what I actually think that Cyril is doing there is suggesting that if you don't apply some form of race-based pencil testing, that is not true BEE. And we need something like that because we can use it as a test in order to enrich ANC elites, which is exactly what happens right now. Now, the president's stance comes amidst growing business frustration that BEE has not meaningfully reduced poverty, but instead enriched political patronage. And this is factual. Now, critics argue that BEE has created elite capture numerous times. In fact, it's not just critics. Zondo referenced it. Zondo himself said that state capture had been enabled by BEE. And critics say that it scares off investors, with some critics saying that it's led to trillions of rands being lost in the economy due to BEE. Ramaphosa says that it's all part of inclusive growth, even though we have not had any form of meaningful economic growth in like decades. So where this inclusive growth is coming in, no one knows, because we do not have any form of meaningful growth rate. If you think 0.5% is growth, you need your head checked. It is the smallest, most pathetic growth rate in any emerging market. If you've seen the graphs, South Africa just sucks in terms of growth. And a lot of this can be put down to BEE. Now, any president that wasn't a useless fool would say, well, if we've done a policy for a very long time and it's not actually given us the results that we're hoping to do, we should probably change that policy. But when you're an ideologue, you generally tend to believe your own nonsense. Now, this political rigidity sets the tone for what some economists call an ideological stalemate, a government unwilling to reform the very system that everybody knows has failed the poor. And that's what we have in Ramaphosa, the most useless, inept, dumbass president that we have ever had. And moving on to the next news story. Now, this is the story that Ramaphosa has a plan to fix South Africa's joblessness. And what it actually is that he says he's going to massively scale up public sector employment. So effectively, you know that bloated state every single rating agency around the world constantly warns South Africa about? Well, according to Ramaphosa, he's going to bloat it up even more. Even though we can't afford the civil wage bill, the civil service is the largest in the world, the most heavily paid and the most useless across the globe. But Ramaphosa is like, well, I've screwed up the economy. I'm really ideologically rigid in terms of any form of reform that might lead to any forms of meaningful job growth. So, yeah, we'll just increase the public sector. Even though the question then becomes, who the freak's going to pay for it, you fool? Because you can't afford to pay for it right now. In any case, Anna Bernstein, the head of the Center for Development and Enterprise, has suggested that what this really is just a substitute for economic reform. So rather than improving productivity, the state is just essentially buying temporary stability by expanding government payrolls. So that we all know unemployment's high. You've got to reduce unemployment. You can't create meaningful private sector growth because of your dumbass policies. And so they're like, don't worry, the state will pay them salaries and give them jobs to do what? I mean, the state's useless as it is. I mean, what are they going to do? Go work for the post office who's bankrupt and closed and looks like it's been through a war zone? I mean, I've seen places in Gaza that look less beat up than most local post offices. In any case, Bernstein notes that whilst unemployment remains above 32%, the state continues to crowd out private investment with more public jobs. And this is because the state is so useless that where the state generally tends to take over a function, it's unable to compete in the open market. And so what it effectively does is create a monopoly and isolates the work for itself so that it effectively doesn't have any competitors. That way, it can be as useless as it wants and nobody's really going to notice. And for proof of that, think education, think logistics, and think energy. So ultimately, the message is that Ramaphosa intends to use public jobs to calm unrest in the short term and possibly buy himself some votes, given that the municipal elections are due to come in. But without any formal policy change, the economy is being managed into decline, and without a growing economy, you don't have the taxes to support the wages, which in the long term is going to cause you problems. Which actually leads us on to the next news article, and that is that the Department of Public Services has ordered a physical roll call of over 1 million civil servants, because as I said, we have one of the most bloated civil services in the world, and they do nothing. And the department realizes it doesn't actually have any money to pay wages. So what they're trying to do is weed out all of the ghost employees, and there is quite a few of them. Now, this extraordinary measure aims to confirm just how many public employees actually exist, and I'm willing to bet it's not many, with many of them just being ghost workers. That's, in other words, people drawing salaries that don't really exist. Now, this is all part of a larger audit of state employment following concerns of corruption and payroll manipulation. If you followed any of the news around this, the payroll manipulation is astronomical. The amount of money that's being paid every month to employees that just don't exist. I mean, one guy, if you effectively think about it, is getting like 6 people's payroll, and they're all just ghost employees that don't exist, all going to one guy. I mean, it's a great scam if you can get it. Now, South Africa's wage bill is already one of the highest in the developing world, and it consumes roughly 35% of all tax revenue. And that is insane. Analysts say that this underscores government inefficiency and expanding employment to appease unions, because they recognize that many of these unions get a lot of their fees from the government sectors. So the more employment they have, the more, say, for example, COSATU can have members, and that keeps the unions who are part of the tripartite alliance rather happy. But the problem is that there is no measure of output for service delivery. So it doesn't really matter how useless these individuals are. Well, as long as they're getting a paycheck, well, they're not unemployed. And as long as they're getting a paycheck, they can join the unions, which keeps the unions happy. But the problem is that you and me, we have to pay the taxes for services that we effectively don't get. And so we're unhappy. Now, talking of race-based rule, let's move on to the next news article. And this is that the Department of Education has reported a sharp surge in Black university students, whilst white, colored, and Indian enrollments have all plummeted. And again, they're looking at this going, well, why have these numbers depreciated? Why have they gone down? And the answer to anybody with a brain cell is because you put in place positive discrimination policies that stop many from those backgrounds getting into university. But they're like, we don't understand what's going on here. Now, over the past decade, Black African enrollments rose from 66% to nearly 80% of total university students. Now, white student numbers have fallen by more than a third, partly due to immigration. So that's in itself is important, because what you've noticed with the numbers of the white population in South Africa is that many in the youth category that would be going to university have now, well, they've disappeared. They've disappeared with families. And so a lot of the older generation are still in the country, which does mean that we are starting to see shifts and patterns around all sorts of institutional organizations. There are numerous organizations in the country where that middle gap, not the very, very young and not the very, very old, the middle piece, it's just gone. It just kind of left. In any case, many students also, where they do stay, do still choose to go abroad to study. Now, the reason for that is because often they feel that they cannot actually get a university place in a local university in South Africa due to those positive discrimination rules. Now, this has shifted academic standards, with some people suggesting that degrees in South Africa are no longer worth what they once were. It's not to be racist, it's just because in many instances what ends up happening is that the individuals who go to university now, because they're there to fulfill a quota, they might not necessarily have the grades that they once did, which does mean that the university itself may have to, in some instances, lower the pass marks and the educational standards in order to ensure that it still has the award ratio that it once did. Now, experts are warning of deepening racial and class divides. Universities are more demographically representative, but academic performance gaps and graduate employment rates remain stark. So what this effectively means is that people are going to university and getting a degree, they're going out into the workplace and expecting it to mean something, but because of their actual academic performance, with many recognizing that these universities may have had to lower the standards, these individuals are not actually getting the job positions that they thought they would. So it's all good and fine to go spend a huge student debt, you go get your social studies degree if you want, and then you go flip burgers at McDonald's. It's going to leave you pretty annoyed, with many individuals saying, well, what was the point in going to university in the first place? Now, critics say that transformation has focused more on optics rather than outcomes, and this mirrors the broader economic problem, where everything's about representation and nobody cares about the actual opportunities that it creates and the outcomes of those opportunities. As long as we hit the representation numbers, as long as the right people are enriched, such as the ANC elite, then from a point of optics, the government keeps saying it's doing the right thing. Transformation is great. Everything's great. Transformation is key to the growth of the country, even though there is no bloody growth. Transformation is required in universities, so just put any old fool in there, regardless of whether they deserve it or not. That's not to say that everybody shouldn't go to university and that they're all stupid. There are clearly some very bright individuals that go. But at the same time, there are also clearly some very big retarded people that go. So, it works both ways. But across all these stories, we generally tend to see one single thread emerge, and that is that the South African state prefers symbolic successes to actual structural changes. BE remains an ideological dogma. The civil service rolls swell while economies collapse. I don't know where we're going to get the tax to pay for this civil service swelling. And educational reform produces racial balance rather than an actual economic impact or actual proper educational standards. But even when forms of progress does occur in the economy, it always seems to happen outside of government intervention. As Bernstein says in the previous article, real reform means freeing markets and skills, not expanding bureaucracy to pretend reform exists. The problem is, Ramaphosa is unwilling to actually make the hard decisions. Because as I said, he is the most useless president we've ever had. In any case, that's just my views. Do let me know what you think in the comment section below. Until next time, bye.